Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 20 of Opening Basics. Before I get into the substance of this video, I wanted to make a couple of short notes. One is I changed the recording setup here, so I'm recording a larger area on the screen, which should mean the image is higher definition. It's not completely high def, but it's higher definition than it was, so you should be able to blow it up and still get a decent picture. I got a recent complaint about the quality of the video, the low res basically. So I'm trying out a higher res setup. Let me know if you like it, if you can see the difference. The other note I wanted to point out before I get on with it is in the previous video I was talking about the bishop's opening, e4, e5, bishop to c4. And a lot of times, or not a lot of times, sometimes the player with the white pieces has in mind a very quick attack with queen to f3 or to h5, threatening checkmate on f7. So just a few notes about how to deal with that. First of all, if you develop the knight here, which is the main line that controls the h5 square, so the queen can go to f3 and try to harass the knight this way. It's not a problem at this point. You can just develop the other knight, and that's the way to play it. And if your opponent tries a move like g5, for example, a very crude attack, but trying to push the pawn up to g5, chase the knight away, and then checkmate you again, you have the move knight to d4. And this controls all the squares along the f-file, so the queen gets chased away. It has nowhere to go. Actually, the best move is just to go back to d1. And you've got a nice winning position here for white. You're just in great shape. You can even play knight takes g4 here. This is kind of a funny tactic, but if queen takes, then you've got, let's see, well, it says you can throw a knight takes c2 check. That's one threat you have here, but you can also play d5. That's the threat I was going for, where the bishop attacks the queen and the pawn attacks the bishop. So you've got a nice winning game there with black. Okay, and then the other point is if you play the other knight out first, this is a way you can play if you want to avoid some of the trickier gambits and lines in the main line of the bishop's opening. Just bring the knight out here. Now the queen can go all the way to h5, threaten checkmate, and it's too late to bring the knight out to f6 to chase the queen away because you get checkmated anyway. What you play in this position is g6. And it's very important that you have developed this knight which is protecting the e-pawn, because otherwise queen here, check, would be very embarrassing. It would fork the king and the rook, and black would be winning. But the e-pawn is protected by this knight, and the queen has nowhere great to go. Say it drops back to f3, still with the idea of checkmating you. Then now you can play knight f6. The knight's protected by the queen. And once again, if he tries to launch this kind of crude attack, chasing your knight away, you have knight d4. So it's no problem. After the queen retreats, you also have the simple development plan of bishop to g7 and castling. And once you've castled, this pawn on f7 is securely defended, so it's not a problem. So just a quick note for those of you who are interested in how to survive those quick attacks from your opponent. Okay, so let's get on to the main content of the video. We're looking at e4, e5 openings, and we previously looked at all of the main white responses except for the very top choice, which is knight f3. So with this video, we're starting to look at lines beginning with this white move, knight to f3 on move 2. This is, like I said, the most popular move by far, and a very logical move. It follows the opening rule: develop your knights before your bishops. It attacks an undefended pawn in the center, so it comes with tempo. And it asks black the question, what is he going to do about it? And black has two basic ways of responding. He can either defend the pawn, or he can counterattack your e-pawn on e4, because that's undefended. So defending the pawn can be done with knight to c6. That's the top choice. And we get into those mainline positions like the Italian game and the Ruy Lopez. He can defend it with d6. That's the Philidor defense. Or he can counterattack. And the counterattacks our knight to f6. That's what we're going to look at in this video, Petrov's Defense, also called the Russian game. And there are also a couple of gambit lines. He can counterattack with either f5 or d5. This is known as the Latvian Gambit, and this is the Elephant Gambit. So those are not particularly good gambits, but I will take a look at them in later videos. In this video, we're looking at the counterattacking move, knight f6, the Russian game or Petrov's Defense. So the main line here is to go ahead and take that pawn. So let's do that. Perfectly reasonable move. And now there's a line here that's often used to illustrate the dangers of copying your opponent's moves. And that's this move here. It's not particularly good for black to just take the pawn, but you may wonder why it's not working. So the queen comes here. And, well, the first point is, if the knight retreats, he's grabbed a pawn, he goes home successful, and there's this terrible discovered attack. So this actually loses the queen. The king is in check, the queen is under attack. If you block with the bishop, the knight takes queen. If you block with the queen, still knight takes queen. The knight covers both squares. So that just loses the queen for a knight. So that's completely losing. Now, Black can do better. The best play, if you happen to get stuck in this position, you're not actually losing yet. What you can do is you can put the queen here on the same file so that you don't have these discovered attacks. And after white grabs the knight, you can't take back because it's defended, but you can attack it with a pawn. It's actually pinned here, so it can't move away. And then white can defend the pawn. Defend the knight with a pawn. You can take back and develop a piece, and white can defend the pawn. So white can stay a pawn up in this line, but as black you get a little bit of compensation. You get some development for your pieces. Not good enough. I mean, white should still really win this game. He has the advantage, but it's not immediately over, so you can play on if you wander into that one by mistake. So let's take a look at the main line of the Petrov's. So back all the way up to this position. White has just played knight to f3, attacking the pawn. And black has played knight to f6, counterattacking the pawn. And the main line here is taking the pawn, and then instead of grabbing the knight right away, instead of grabbing the pawn right away, kicking the knight with the move d6. And now the knight just drops back. It doesn't really have a better square than going back. And now it's safe to take. And at this point, there's a couple of replies that white has. First of all, the most common reply, let's stick with that, is just put a pawn in the center. And black follows up with the move d5, usually, defending his knight. And so we get a sequence here. This play continues from this point with an attempt to undermine the knight with bishop d3. Black can develop with knight c6. White can castle. And now bishop e7, so that there are no uncomfortable pins along this file, and black is preparing to castle. And I think I will leave the main line here. I mean, the play continues for quite a while. There's a number of different ideas in this position. You can try and pile up on the knight with the rook. You can play c4 to undermine it. But black has ideas too. He castles, and he can play the move knight to b4 to go after this bishop. And it's a position where white has a slight edge, but certainly playable for both sides, and an interesting way to play. So that's the main line Petrov. Actually, the immediate move, if I give a few more moves in the main line, it's c4, knight b4. This idea I said going after the bishop, and then the bishop goes to e2. It needs to hold on to the pawn, and it doesn't want to be traded for the knight, and then black castles. So what's good about this position for both sides is that you get to castle. You're not going to get destroyed immediately, and a long game is in store. White's going to develop his knight to c3, maybe allowing some exchanges here and some pawn damage, but most commonly black plays bishop f5 to reinforce the knight. So all the pieces are coming out. Because a pair of pawns have been traded in the center, and this is an open position, and neither side is cramped. Technically, white still has a slight opening edge, so a3 kicking the knight, and it continues. So I don't want to go into any more of the main line like that. I just wanted to emphasize that's a playable position for both sides. Now, recently, let's go back to the start. Recently, there's been a variation on the main line that's become more popular as people have avoided the ultimate main line, which I just showed. So, knight attacking the pawn, knight counterattacking, taking the pawn, kicking it with d6, drops back, now taking the pawn, d4, d5, defending the knight. Oh, no, back up. Before d4. Instead of d4, the new idea, or it's not that new, but it's been played more often recently, is just to develop the knight immediately to c3, challenging this knight in the center even before black has had time to play the move d5 to defend it there. And now the move here is, the most common move is knight takes. And the way it's usually played, almost 100% of the time, d takes c3. And the idea is that white has got open lines for his bishop. He's suffered some pawn damage here. He's got doubled c-pawns, and actually black has a pawn in the center, but it's not a very advanced pawn, so it's not much of a factor. And what white is mainly banking on is these open lines for his pieces and getting in a quick queenside castling. So the main line goes bishop e7, black's preparing to castle kingside, bishop f4, knight c6, or castling, either one, queen to d2, and castles here, bishop e6. Let's say it keeps developing his pieces and castles queenside. The other line is instead of knight to c6 to castle, for black to castle immediately in that position. But you get similar kinds of ideas. You get a position with actually still a slight pull for white in spite of his in spite of his doubled pawns here. He's very quickly getting his pieces to the center of the board. So he has a slight lead in development, and but the material is very even. Neither side has the advantage of the bishop pair. Both sides have two bishops, and well, a long game can ensue from here. Okay, I just wanted to mention that as a way that people have been playing recently, just as a way of avoiding the main line of the Petrov, with the feeling that white didn't have any great advantage there, and they're looking for new avenues and new ways to play. So if we back up, I actually play a slightly different variation of that myself. So when I play, I'll go ahead and show you. A knight here attacking the pawn, counterattacking, take the pawn, get kicked back, drop back, knight takes. I play this move knight c3 with the idea of taking with the b pawn. Now this is not in the opening book at all, I have to admit, and so you may want to take this with a grain of salt, but it's not a bad move. It still keeps white with some edge. In this position, of course, you're going to castle kingside, but the idea is you're going to get the move in d4 in. You're still going to have open lines for your bishops after you play d4, and you'll have a little bit more center influence. And I find this is a reasonable position for white to play. You have to play for activity, because in the long run, these pawns over here may be a weakness. But I find it's a playable position. Let's see. Suppose we continue bishop e7, d4, castles, and now bishop d3. Very typical kind of setup. There's still some slight edge to white here. So an interesting way to play, and one that's not in the opening books. So if you want to surprise your opponent with something that's not so common but still quite playable, that's an idea for you. Okay, so let's go back to going back to the book. There's one really interesting line here that I just have to show you. It's called the Cochran Gambit. So knight f3 attacking the pawn, knight f6 counterattacking, the Petrov's defense. White goes ahead and takes the pawn right away, executing his threat, and black kicks the knight with d6. So instead of humbly retreating the knight, there's this crazy gambit. Knight takes f7. This is known as the Cochran Gambit, and it's you're not just gambiting a pawn, you're gambiting a whole knight. So this is like those gambits in the King's Gambit, where white just gives up a whole piece. And you have a surprising amount of compensation. Technically speaking, black is slightly better in this position, but he does have to play carefully. And you look at all the activity you get. First of all, you start off with d4. You get a lot of space in the center. And you always have this bishop c4 check coming at some point. Suppose black plays a natural move like bishop e7, trying to find a space for his king. You can come out with the check. And now d5 to block it. You start getting some material back. You can take a pawn now, or dropping back to b3 appears to be a good move in this point. And let's see, can I give a few more moves? Knight takes, e4, bishop to e6. Let's say we keep developing pieces. That's usually a good recipe, trying to defend things. Then e5, kicking this knight here. Knight drops back to e8. Knight to c3. You're still a piece down, but you have, like I said, you have a surprising amount of compensation. This king is still exposed over here. Your pieces are coming out easily. You can castle. Let's see, I'll give a few more. This is a computer line. c6, queen f3 check. So finally the queen comes out and you start giving some direct attacks. I mean, that's the funny thing about it. So the chess engine rates this as only very slightly in favor of black. It gives it a score of negative 0.2, so not even a pawn. So that means white really has tremendous amount of compensation in this position. And so it is kind of interesting. You know, you've got to get all of your pieces out and active and try and take advantage of the exposed position of black's king, and also try to establish a strong center. Those are the keys to playing this position if you want to try it out. Might be fun, particularly in a blitz game. But this has been played in tournament games. Topalov played a game in the Cochran Gambit back in 1999, so not too long ago, and he was just he was in a bit of a slump, and he was trying something different to get him out of it. So that's the Cochran Gambit. Let's take a look at a couple more lines. So knight f3 attacking the pawn, knight f6, the Petrov's defense. Now, the most natural move is just to take the pawn, and that's certainly the main line, and a lot of good things can ensue after that we've already looked at. There's two other moves here. Let's take a look at knight c3 here. This move a lot of times will just transpose to another opening. For example, if black develops his knight here, which is a natural response, then we're just in a four knights defense. But if black plays a different move, say bishop b4 would be the most popular alternative, then we're into a slightly different flavor of the Petrov's. You can grab the pawn now, and black castles with the idea not of getting the pawn back immediately, but getting the rook to the e-file and eventually getting this pawn back. Now, white needs to, well, it's a good idea for white. I don't say necessarily he needs to, but it's a good idea for him to block the e-file and get his king to safety too in this position. Rook e8, and the knight here can drop back to d3. It's an interesting option that wasn't available in other lines, where it's kicking the bishop and forcing some exchanges. So you suffer a bit of pawn damage here, but on the other hand, you've won the bishop pair. Black, as compensation, has he's got his king to safety, and he's got a couple of pieces development, so he has a decent development advantage. Say if you castle here, let's back up. Did we actually, oh, d takes c3 is once again the main line. Yeah, I take with the b pawn quite often, as I mentioned. Then knight takes e4, and then castles. And we get this kind of position where black is doing okay here. White has suffered some pawn damage, but white does have the bishop pair, so compensating advantages and disadvantages. But there's no big attack on black's king, and he's going to have time to develop the pieces on the queen side and get an okay game from this position. So that's one way to play. That's the immediate knight c3. And the last variation I wanted to look at is known as the Steinitz variation. Steinitz used to play this way, and occasionally you'll see this. So there's the Russian defense, or the Petrov's defense. And that's the move d4 here. So just putting another pawn in the center, not bothering to defend the e-pawn. And black in this position has a choice of which pawn to take, and either capture is valid. The most popular one is taking, getting into similar kinds of positions that we've seen. So after the bishop comes out here, you can play d5, and this actually transposes, if we take here, transposes into a position. No, I take that back. It's not a transposition because in the other line the pawn went to d6 and then to d5 to chase this knight back. But anyway, this position has a lot of similarities to other positions we've seen in the Petrov, where this knight is going to come under pressure and both sides are going to get to castle. The other capture, let's see, after knight to after he takes a pawn, you could also take back this way. Another way to play, and then d5 could be played supporting the knight. Kind of an interesting position, sort of reminiscent of the open Ruy Lopez, where you get this advanced pawn here supported by the knight. You have to ask yourself if this pawn is a strength or a weakness. And then there's the other capture in this position after d4. Okay, knight f6 with the counterattack, d4. You can also take with the pawn here. And now e5 is an interesting move here. But we can get into a similar kind of position after the knight comes to e4. We get queen takes pawn, putting a little pressure on this knight, and d5 here defending it. So a lot of similar kinds of ideas in this position. This one, the queen looks pretty active here. Let's see, I'll go on a couple more moves. Taking en passant and knight coming back is the most common move. So it looks like maybe white has a slight edge in development. But, well, it's a very symmetrical pawn structure. The material balance is completely equal, and black is going to get this move in knight c6 with a tempo on the queen at some point. So it's a pretty even position. Maybe white still has some slight opening edge. Let's see, knight c3 is the normal move here. Knight c6, and the queen goes to f4. So white tries to keep the queen active and do some useful things with it in this line. Okay, so that wraps up my coverage of the Russian game, or Petrov's Defense. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave any comments in the section below, and I will see you again soon. Bye.